According to myths around the world, the devil is always looking for more souls to collect. This practice isn't mentioned anywhere in the Bible, but there are plenty of accounts in other religions, literature, and art. For example, Dante's The Divine Comedy, which was written in the 14th century, riffs on this concept. Other stories involve the devil and demons looking for humans to give up their souls in exchange for riches, some kind of favor, or the bestowment of special powers. These are the so-called deals with the devil. The best-known ancient example is the story of Faust, a German legend dating to the 16th century. A depressed and bored scholar attempts suicide. When that fails, he calls upon the devil to make things better. "Give me magic powers, give me knowledge, and a chance to indulge in all the pleasure of this world," he said. The devil, known as Mephistopheles in this story, says, "Sure, you can have all you want for a few years. But when the time is up, you will give me your soul, and you will be my slave forever." Faust says, "Deal." And for a while, he gets everything he wants, including lots of sex. Things inevitably turn out bad for him, and per his contract, is carried off to hell. Maybe. There are other versions of the story where he gains redemption and gets to keep his soul. Okay, how does one get an appointment with the devil with the purpose of selling their soul? Well, mostly you meet him at a crossroads at midnight, where you discuss terms and then sign the contract, probably in blood. Over the centuries, sea captains, generals, and painters are said to have sold their souls in exchange for worldly things, and so have a number of musicians. The most famous of these stories is connected to blues musician Robert Johnson. It is said he made a deal with the devil and was bestowed with an almost supernatural ability to play the guitar. Robert Johnson eventually died at the age of 27. But what really happened? Was he murdered? Or did his contract simply expire? I'm Alan Cross, and this is episode 30 of Uncharted Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. Let's take a trip to the crossroads to see whom we might find there. And here's a hint. We'll find more than just Robert Johnson.
Say, poor Bob, if you please. Stand at the crossroads. I trust the flag of ride.
That's legendary bluesman Robert Johnson, recorded in a makeshift studio setup in room 414 of the Gunter Hotel in San Antonio, Texas, on November 27, 1936. He'd written that song a few years earlier, maybe 1932, and it's based on the legend of selling one's soul to the devil at a crossroads. Johnson recorded 2 takes. Those became part of a catalog that included 29 songs and 59 performances made over 5 days at the Gunter and 1 other location. 25 were released on the Vocalion label on 1278 RPM records between 1937 and 1939. All of those recordings were in danger of disappearing because the 78s went out of print. But in 1959, reissues started. And then, in 1990, Columbia Records released a comprehensive collection, and it sold very well. Johnson would never see any money or praise from these extraordinary recordings because he died on August 16, 1938. 20 years later, he'd become one of the most influential guitarists of all time. You can draw a line from Chuck Berry, Keith Richards, Bob Dylan, Duane Allman, Eric Clapton, Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, and hundreds of others back to Robert Johnson. But we'll get to that. We need to go deeper into the legend of the crossroads first. This goes much deeper than most people realize. The ancient Greeks believed that the intersection of 2 roads was very special. Rituals developed around the gods Hecate and Hermes. The Romans later picked up on these rituals with ceremonies involving the mischievous and deceitful god Mercury. In Middle Ages Britain, a tradition evolved where criminals and suicides were buried at crossroads, perhaps because these intersections were outside the boundaries of the village. Burying them there avoided spiritual contamination. The Faust legend, which evolved greatly over the decades, took root. In one version of the story, Faust draws magic circles at a crossroads in order to summon Satan. This led to folk tales about going to a crossroads to obtain magic bullets from the devil. In Romania, Transylvania in fact, lore said that the devil could be summoned at a crossroads with a magic circle, reciting an incantation, and being prepared to pay the devil with a copper coin. Versions of these superstitions made the trip on African slave ships bound for America, specifically in the form of hoodoo, a type of spirituality that included something called the Congo cosmogram. It's connected to selling your soul to the devil at a crossroads in exchange for some very specific things: the ability to dance, luck at throwing dice, and increased skill at playing a musical instrument. It is this hoodoo that became ingrained in African American culture, and eventually it leads us to the story of Robert Johnson, but not quite yet. He wasn't the first to head to the crossroads at midnight. The first musician rumored to make this kind of deal was Giuseppe Tartini, a violinist from Venice who wrote this. That was written around 1799, according to Tartini, when the devil appeared to him in a dream. His story was picked up by Niccolò Paganini, a 19th century Italian violinist who claimed he'd made a deal with the devil to be able to write more beautiful music. Around the same time, Philippe Moussard, a French composer, thought he'd apply the story to him, and he dined out a lot on that. The first American and the first blues musician said to make a deal with the devil is Tommy Johnson, no relation to Robert. If you've ever seen the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, you know his name. He's a character in the movie who describes selling his soul to the devil in order to become a killer guitar player. The real Tommy Johnson was from Mississippi and played across the South, recording whenever he could. He became legendary for his intricate guitar playing and for singing in a falsetto. The effect was quite eerie. Tommy Johnson was probably the biggest Delta blues singer of his day. Not only did he have a very versatile voice, he also did guitar tricks, playing it behind his head and throwing it in the air. To add to his fame, and to create a sinister image, he told everyone that his ability had been bestowed upon him by the devil after he sold his soul at the crossroads at midnight. After influencing many other guitarists, Howling Wolf among them, Tommy Johnson died of a heart attack at age 60 in 1956 after playing a party. Remember his name because we have to come back to him. Here's where we finally get to Robert Johnson. He was born in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, probably on May 11, 1911, and was one of 10 children. When the family was forced out of town by a lynch mob, they settled in Memphis. It was there that Robert developed a love for music. He especially loved the blues, which was a new thing back then. In 1929, he married 14-year-old Virginia Travis, but after she died during childbirth, her relatives blamed Robert, saying that her death was divine punishment for Robert singing all those ungodly blues songs. This, to the relatives, was selling his soul to the devil. With few roots, Robert moved from place to place. He developed something of a reputation among other musicians. He was a decent harmonica player, but his guitar playing was, well, there's no other way around it. It was just awful. He got no respect in that department. This hurt him a lot because it was his dream to become a great blues musician, specifically a great blues guitarist. Not gonna happen, he was told. Maybe go off and practice, and when you learn what to do, maybe we'll let you play with us. Maybe. So Johnson slunk off for 2 years, and when he returned, everything about him was different. He could play guitar like the devil. And this is where things get interesting. As an adult, Robert Johnson lived a largely nomadic life. He also became this killer guitar player, but how? Again, Johnson was embarrassingly bad as a guitar player just a few years earlier, and this is where the legend begins. In the late 1920s, he left Robinsonville, a town in northwestern Mississippi, and just kind of disappeared for a couple of years, or so it's said. It's believed that he went to the area around Martinsville, a tiny place south of Hazelhurst where he was born. One version of his story says that he was on a quest to find his birth father. But not much is known about this time in Johnson's life. We do know that he fathered a child, abandoned that woman, got married to another woman in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and then she died. From then on, Johnson became a walking musician, which meant he walked from place to place playing gigs and sitting in with other musicians whenever he could. He practiced a lot, most likely. Lots and lots of practice, along with studying other blues players, including the legendary Son House and another bluesman named Ike Zimmerman. Now, Zimmerman is very important to this story. He was a spinner of yarns, and it was said that he learned to play through supernatural means. His power, it is said, came from visiting graveyards at midnight and playing and playing and playing. It appears that Johnson met Zimmerman at some point, and the two of them did practice at night in a local graveyard, not to summon the devil or any demons, but because it was so quiet, and out in the graveyard, no one would disturb them. They had several favorite graveyards in the Hazelhurst area. Johnson spent about a year learning from Zimmerman, and by the time he returned to Robinsonville, he was good. I mean, really good. Really, really good. Too good, in fact. His skills were so incredible that they actually seemed otherworldly. The legend goes like this. One night in the early 1930s, Johnson, who was living at a cotton plantation, was instructed to take his guitar to a nearby crossroads at midnight. He was met there by a large black man, apparently the devil, who took Johnson's guitar, tuned it, and then used it to play a few songs. The devil then gave the guitar back to Johnson, transferring the devil's musical wizardry to him. And for the rest of his life, Johnson possessed these amazing creative powers. So, which crossroads exactly? We don't know. There were several candidates. One is at the intersection of Highway 61 and 49 in Clarksdale, Mississippi. This is what the local tourist board will have everyone believe. They hype up the Johnson connection a lot. Those crossroads might have been at the intersection of Highways 1 and 8 in Rosedale, Mississippi. Or it might have been somewhere near Beulah, Mississippi. Or it may have been somewhere else. Remember, Robert Johnson was a walking musician and always on the move. But does it really matter where these crossroads were? Only if you believe in the devil's ability to make an ordinary guitar player into something extraordinary. It's also very possible that everyone has this wrong. Again, it was Tommy Johnson who also claimed to have learned to play from the devil. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the crossroads story was misattributed to Robert when it was really all about Tommy. Again, this doesn't really matter unless the Satan thing is true, but that shouldn't get in the way of our story. Let's not spoil a great myth with too much truth and science. What is true is that Robert Johnson impressed a lot of people with his guitar playing, and the devil figured into a lot of his songs, allegedly. Or maybe it wasn't the devil. If we do some cultural anthropology, it's possible that Johnson isn't singing about the devil, but Legba, an African god, figured into African-American lore. Legba also met his customers at, yes, a crossroads. Whether it be Legba, the devil, or just lots of practice, Robert Johnson quickly developed a reputation after returning from whatever wilderness he'd retreated to. What was so special about his playing? Well, first, Johnson was versatile. He could twist the blues into all kinds of different shapes, incorporating country music, a little jazz, a bit of ragtime, and a lot of slide guitar. Those who heard him couldn't believe that he wasn't accompanied by a second guitarist. He could flip effortlessly between playing straight chords to picking at the strings to playing rhythms to bottleneck slides. If you want to get into the weeds, Johnson used a boogie bass pattern or a boogie shuffle that previously had only been heard on a piano. No one, apparently, played this on guitar until Robert Johnson. And once he started doing it, others began copying him. And this is just one way Robert Johnson changed the sound of Delta blues. Johnson was able to pick up a song after hearing it just once. And compared to other blues players, his song constructions and lyrics were more complex. Some likened Johnson's lyrics to poetry. Whatever the case, he spent more time thinking about the words to sing than most other bluesmen, who tended to just improvise as they played. Then there was his singing. Few could match the emotion with which Johnson sang. He had a lot of range and employed all sorts of vocal dynamics. One of the best examples of this is a recording of Me and the Devil Blues, recorded in an old Warner Brothers office in Dallas on June 20th, 1937.
Me and the devil was walking side by side.
From 1932 on, Johnson stayed largely in Mississippi, although he did loop into Arkansas, up to St. Louis, then Chicago, through Indiana to Detroit, into Canada, and then through New York, Kentucky, and Texas. He'd busk on street corners, usually in front of a restaurant or the local barber shop. When he got a proper gig in a juke joint or a tavern of some sort, he charmed audiences. He was well-mannered, soft-spoken, pleasant to people, but also very, very private. For some reason, he rarely identified himself as Robert Johnson. Records show that he used at least 8 different surnames between 1937 and his death in 1938. Wherever he went, he called himself something else, and this has made it hard to piece together this part of his life. Eyewitness accounts are kind of shaky too. We do know that Robert liked his whiskey and his women, often using women he met on the road for a place to stay. Sometime in 1936, we think, Johnson went looking for Henry Spear, a talent agent and record store owner in Jackson, Mississippi, who had a reputation for helping out other blues musicians across the South. In fact, they called him the godfather of Delta blues. Spear connected Johnson with Ernie Ortle, who worked for a group of record labels called the American Record Corporation. He, in turn, introduced Johnson to Don Law. Law was in the business of recording bluesmen for Ortle's label, as well as Vocalion Records of New York City. Arrangements were made for Johnson to record some songs between November 23rd and 27th in a makeshift recording studio set up in a room of the Gunter Hotel in San Antonio, Texas. Johnson was recorded performing various versions of 16 songs. It was just him and his beat-up acoustic guitar. On day one of the sessions, 8 songs were committed to an old-school acetate recorder. This was one of them. It would eventually be released on the Vocalion label in March 1937. It became a hit in the South, selling about 10,000 copies.
I said I flash your lights, mama. Your horn won't even blow. Somebody that run my best is done on this machine. I even flash my lights, mama. This horn won't even blow.
That's called Terraplane Blues. A terraplane was a car built by Hudson. Of course, Johnson isn't singing about a car. The whole thing is a metaphor for sex. We are talking about the blues, of course. Johnson's next recording session was at the warehouse of Vitagraph and Warner Brothers in Dallas on June 19th and 20th, 1937. Another 13 songs were committed to an acetate machine in various forms. What's interesting about these 2 recording sessions is that Johnson, unlike most other blues players, understood that a 78 RPM record could only hold about 3 minutes of music per side, so he tailored his performances to fit the format. And this helped standardize the length of blues recordings from then on. Here's another example. This is called Me and the Devil, which clocks in at a tight 2 minutes and 37 seconds. It appeared on side 1 of a 10-inch released in 1938, the second to last of his recordings to be issued through the Vocalion label.
Early this morning, he knocked upon my door. I said, hello, Satan, I believe it's time to go.
That's just one of several devil songs that Johnson was known to perform. You may bury my body down by the highway side, so my old evil spirit can catch a Greyhound bus and ride. Robert Johnson recorded 29 songs in various forms for a total of 59 recordings, if you count all the alternate takes. He only spent 5 days in the studio in his entire life. Those songs were all released as 78s, but never really brought him much money. Like I said, his most successful release was Terraplane Blues. A couple of records sold maybe 5,000 copies. Everything else was essentially a stiff by commercial standards. By the time his fame as a blues guitarist started to spread, he was long dead. And this is where we get to some crime. Maybe. After Robert Johnson left that final recording session in Dallas on June 20th, 1937, we're really not sure what he did next. He wandered about, playing wherever he could, staying with whoever would put him up for a night or two, and drinking plenty of whiskey and womanizing a lot. It appears that in the weeks leading up to his death, Johnson played at a dance hall on a plantation about 15 miles away from Greenwood. He'd apparently traveled down from the nearby town of Tunica, which is on Highway 61, halfway between Memphis and Clarksdale. On August 16, 1938, he died, and we don't know why. It wasn't until 30 years later, in 1968, that a musicologist found a death certificate. This is the only reason we know that Johnson died at the age of 27. No cause of death is listed, and there was no autopsy. But there are theories, of course. 2, to be specific. The first theory is that he died of complications involving syphilis. The man was a dog, after all. No doubt about that. And in the era before antibiotics, syphilis was a killer. This is a possibility, but we don't know for sure. The best guess any medical historians have is that it was probably at least a contributing factor to his death. The second theory is that he was murdered. Lore says that Johnson was flirting with a married woman at a dance hall on about August 13, 1938. Her jealous husband then spiked a bottle of whiskey with some kind of poison, and that bottle eventually made it to Johnson. Just as he was about to take a drink, the woman is said to have tried to prevent him from taking a slug, saying that he should never ever drink from a bottle that he hadn't opened himself. Johnson's reply was, "Woman, don't ever knock a bottle out of my hand." And he took a big swig. Later that night, Johnson was offered another bottle, and it too was apparently poisoned. Or so the story goes. Late that evening, Johnson said he wasn't feeling well and had to be helped back to his room. Over the next 3 days, his health failed, and nothing seemed to work. Convulsions set in. He was in terrible pain, and then he died. What kind of poison would do this? Strychnine, a common crystalline poison used on rats and other vermin, is a possibility. It does cause convulsions and makes it impossible to breathe. It's extremely toxic to humans. Modern toxicologists, though, aren't so sure about this being the cause of Robert Johnson's death. Strychnine has a very bitter taste that comes through even when it's mixed into something strong like whiskey. And a person would have to consume a lot of strychnine-laced whiskey in one sitting for it to be fatal. A more plausible poison might be naphthalene, which can be extracted by melting mothballs. It's said that this was a very common way of poisoning in the Deep South around this time, but it usually only made people sick and was rarely fatal. However, Johnson, as we've learned, was a big drinker. We know he had stomach ulcers from all the booze, and his esophagus was a mess with sores and compromised veins. What may have happened is that the naphthalene caused the ulcers and the sores in the veins to hemorrhage. This would explain the pain, the vomiting, the convulsions, and bleeding from the mouth. Many years later, a blues researcher claimed to have tracked down the jealous husband. The man confessed to poisoning Johnson, but his name has never been revealed. A third theory is that Johnson wasn't poisoned at all. In 2006, a doctor took a close look at some of the very few pictures of Robert Johnson that exist. He noticed that Johnson had unnaturally long fingers, something that helped with his guitar playing, but may have also indicated that he had Marfan syndrome. This is a genetic disorder that affects the connective tissue of the body. People with Marfan have very flexible joints, tend to be tall and thin with long arms, legs, and fingers. They also suffer from curved spines. Joey Ramone had Marfan, and so did King Tut, apparently. Possible and common fatal complications of Marfan involve the cardiovascular system, which includes aortic aneurysms. When this happens, the aorta, the biggest artery in the body, balloons to twice or more of its normal size. A person has no idea there's a problem until the artery ruptures, causing extreme pain in the abdomen. A person with a ruptured aorta will bleed out internally and has a better than 80% chance of dying before they get help. This is how we lost actors Alan Thicke, John Ritter, Lucille Ball, George C. Scott, Albert Einstein, and Andy Fletcher of Depeche Mode. The chances of a Marfan sufferer having an aortic aneurysm increase if that person is a heavy drinker and heavy smoker. Johnson was both. And given his lifestyle, he probably had high blood pressure and some manner of coronary artery disease. Johnson wasn't able to get any medical attention because the white owner of the plantation wasn't about to spend any money on a black man who didn't work for him. And besides, the owner thought it was syphilis and didn't think anything could be done for Johnson. Was there a funeral? We don't know. Where is Robert Johnson buried? We don't know. Well, we have 3 grave sites claiming to be the final resting place of Robert Johnson, but no one knows if any of them are real. One spot is an unmarked grave on the grounds of the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church near Morgan City, Mississippi. It's not actually a city, but a village of about 250 people near Clarksdale. Research conducted in the 80s and 90s was enough for a 1-ton cenotaph to be erected that's inscribed with all the titles of Robert Johnson's songs. Or Johnson may be beneath a marker in a cemetery near Quito, Mississippi, about 6 miles away. This resting place was identified by an Atlanta band called, and I'm not making this up, the Tombstones, who put the marker up after members read in a magazine that this site was identified by one of Johnson's many ex-girlfriends. Or Robert Johnson's remains might be under a large pecan tree in the cemetery of Little Zion Church north of Greenwood. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that this is the correct spot because of testimony from the wife of the man who dug the grave in 1938. Most Robert Johnson scholars believe that this, in fact, is where Robert Johnson is buried. Then again, he died itinerant, poor, and black. It's quite possible that his body was committed to a pauper's grave somewhere near the plantation where he died. This brings us back to the legend of the devil at the crossroads. Remember the bluesman Tommy Johnson? He also grew up in Mississippi. He also was a great guitar player. And when he was alive, he claimed to have sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads at midnight in exchange for a supernatural ability to play the guitar. He told that story to everyone, anyone who would listen. And then he died in 1956 at the age of 60. It is very possible, likely even, that the devil story was misattributed to Robert Johnson when it really should have applied to Tommy Johnson. And like I said earlier, the two were not related. When Robert Johnson's recordings were rediscovered and re-released in the late 1950s, the devil legend became inextricably intertwined with him. And remember, Tommy Johnson had just died a few years earlier. And despite plenty of research in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s showing that everyone had the two Johnsons mixed up, it's the legend of Robert Johnson that took hold. And you can see why. His supposed 2-year disappearance, after which he suddenly was a guitar master, his mysterious wanderings, his mentorship by Ike Zimmerman and their supposed practice sessions sitting on tombstones and graveyards after midnight. And there's a dearth of evidence and stories about Robert Johnson that can be actually verified. There are only 3 certified pictures of Robert Johnson known to exist, and none of those were found until the 1980s. There are his very, very spotty biographical details, much of which are still in dispute despite decades of researchers trying to track down the truth. And then there's the paltry 29 songs. That's it. And his death at the age of 27, be it murder or something else. Who are Robert Johnson's heirs? That was very difficult to determine since Johnson probably had a number of children out of wedlock and Johnson died without a will. A truck driver from Mississippi named Claude Johnson was finally declared to be Johnson's official descendant, his son. He received at least $1 million in royalties generated by the sale of his father's work. He died in 2015 at the age of 83, leaving everything to his 6 children. The truth is that the legend of Robert Johnson meeting the devil at the crossroads really didn't catch on until 1961, when Columbia Records released a compilation entitled King of the Delta Blues Singers. In retrospect, this was perfect timing in the history of rock. The record found its way into the hands of a young Bob Dylan, a young Keith Richards, a young Eric Clapton, a young Jimi Hendrix, a young Robert Plant, a young Jimmy Page. It also influenced the work of the electric blues of Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, and Willie Dixon. All of these artists publicly and repeatedly credited Robert Johnson as being a major influence. So, no wonder Johnson became so revered. He's now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He received a posthumous Grammy Award. He's been on a U.S. postage stamp, and his recordings are in the Library of Congress. And even though he never sold many records in his lifetime, or in the 50-plus years after he died, a box set issued in 1990 eventually sold 1 million copies. Who killed Robert Johnson? Why did he die? We'll never know. And there are plenty of other things we'll never find out either. You can catch up on all episodes of Uncharted by downloading them from your favorite podcast platform. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, shoot me an email, alan@alancross.ca. We can also meet up on all the social media sites, along with my website, ajournalofmusicalthings.com. It's updated with music news and recommendations every day. And then there's the free daily newsletter that you should get. Oh, and please check out my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music at large. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can enjoy for free. See you next time for more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.